In today's episode, I want to talk about two authors. First, Critias, who was a sophist of ancient Athens. He was a contemporary of Socrates and to some extent of Plato. By sophist, I mean an orator, a rhetorician, somebody who could make persuasive speeches to large crowds or to a courtroom, and especially somebody who could teach others how to do that. And Critias became famous not so much for his oratory, but because probably through that oratory, among other things, he became a tyrant in Athens. And the fragment that survives, which he probably wrote, describes his view of what it is to run a tyranny. The other author I want to talk about in this episode is Foucault. In fact, that's the major part of this episode. Foucault was a 20th century philosopher, died in the 1980s, French philosopher of the generation of 1968, a series of philosophers who became very famous during that period. And of his many books, the classic that's emerged, I think, for most people is called Discipline and Punish, about the prison system. And as so often with Foucault, he uses institutions to embody philosophical ideas, or rather he thinks institutions embody philosophical ideas. So even though he's telling the story of an institution, it's a philosophy. It's a history of an institution, but it's thereby a philosophy. And the reason I'm saying we're going to do mostly Foucault is that last episode I talked about Plato's cave. And that's a strange story about, prisoners at the bottom of a cave. They've been there since childhood and so on. And it's a kind of crazy tale. Now, when Glaucon says to Socrates, that's a strange tale you tell of, as with strange prisoners, Socrates says, they are like us. And so the lesson of the cave, it has many lessons, but the overarching lesson is to see how it is that we, wherever we are, whoever we are in a cave of some sort. And the reason why I want to talk about Foucault, especially in this episode, is that because he's such a recent philosopher, and I think was so prescient and perceptive in studying the patterns of modern society, he has a fascinating and I think to some extent true idea about what kind of prison, what kind of cave we're in without recognizing it. And remember that for Plato, what really keeps those prisoners imprisoned is that the images they see on the wall, they think to be real. And the biggest tool of imprisonment in that cave is the trick about reality, thinking that something is real when in fact it's a created illusion by the puppeteers in the case of the allegory of the cave. And what Foucault shows, or argues at any rate, is that we are in a kind of cave, modern society, with these particular patterns he calls discipline. And what keeps us trapped there most deeply is that we don't notice that we're living in an age of discipline. So that's the transition between last episode and this episode. And I'm going to start with Critias, however, the contemporary of Socrates and to some extent Plato, because Critias expresses very simply what I take to be the main idea in Foucault. And that's also there in Plato. So there's only one surviving fragment of Critias. Some people even think this is from a play lost by Euripides. And because it's so short, I'm going to read it. And as I did with Plato, I'm going to give a commentary on it as I go. And that will be unusual probably for this series of podcasts. I typically speak extemporaneously and don't read and give commentaries on passages. But in this case, I want to do that because it's so short. So here is from Critias, the 5th century BC, sophist and eventually tyrant of Athens. There was a time when the life of men was uncivilized and bestial and subservient to brute force, a time when neither was there any prize for the good, nor for the wicked did any chastisement arise. I'll just stop for a moment. That sentence expresses an idea that later came to be known in the modern period as the state of nature. Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher of the 17th century, John Locke, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France are the canonical thinkers for discussing the state of nature, one of the founding ideas of modern liberalism. And the idea stems from this group of thinkers in Athens of the 5th century, the Sophists. And the link is quite distinct. Hobbes was a translator of Thucydides, the Greek historian. And Thucydides, in telling the history of the war between Athens and Sparta, recorded, or at least gave us many speeches by Athenians, Athenian politicians. And these speeches were clearly influenced by the thinking of the Sophists and by the rhetorical techniques of the Sophists. And of course, we can't know whether those speeches were as sophistical as Thucydides gives them to us, or whether Thucydides used sophistic thinking and style to dress up those speeches. But in any case, Thomas Hobbes translated Thucydides into English, and thereby, if not otherwise, became familiar with this idea of the state of nature that was integral to sophistic thinking. All right, so what is this idea of the state of nature? It's a conception of human life before civilization, before laws. And of course, this never existed. There was never a time when there were human beings that didn't live in groups and have codes for how they interacted. I mean, they didn't have to be written codes, of course. There was a long time when humans didn't write. But a human being simply can't survive on his own. And groups, tribes, if you like, can't survive if they don't have codes for how to interact with one another. So the state of nature is a fantasy. And it's interesting to think about whether the fact that it's fantastical and never occurred, whether that matters at all to liberalism, the modern political philosophy that uses often this state of nature thought to ground its arguments. At any rate, Critias is here describing that state where there are no laws, where humans live independent of one another. And as Hobbes would later go on to say, when he used this idea, life in that state of nature was nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Humans did not fare well, even in the fantasy, by not having laws. And so that's why Critias says this was a time when there wasn't any prize for the good, because there was no conception of the good, at least that was enforced, nor did for the wicked any punishment arise. You could do whatever you like, but it was a miserable state for everyone. And he says next, it seems to me that men next set up laws as chastisers, that justice might become tyrant and might have arrogance as a slave. So that's the transition between the state of nature, as it's later called, and the state of civil society, as it's called in English philosophy of the modern period. Somehow, it's not said here in this short fragment what exactly happens, laws are set up. And how do laws function? Well, they make it explicit how you should behave. They make it explicit certain things you should not do. And they make it explicit what will happen to you if you're caught doing those things. So the laws are chastisers. And through the imposition of laws, justice, as he says, might become tyrant. That's a very sophistical play on words. Justice is supposed to be opposed to tyranny and vice versa. And here, if laws are imposed, then justice becomes the tyrant and might have arrogance as a slave. In other words, arrogance would have characterized the state of nature where everybody was seeking power and exploiting one another in this war of all against all, as Hobbes later called it. But once laws are set up, arrogance becomes the slave to justice, according to Critias. Okay, so continuing. Should anyone commit an error, he was penalized. Next, since laws hindered them from committing obvious crimes by force, yet they acted secretly, it seems to me, that at this point, and here I'll stop, Critias is recognizing a problem in this scenario, and it later becomes a huge problem for the liberal tradition that founds itself oftentimes on this state of nature conceit. And the problem is that if civil order depends on laws and the enforcement of laws, that means that it applies only when the representatives of the law, the police force, for example, catch somebody in the crime. So the clever person recognizes, best of all is for me to live in a society where there are these laws, so I get the benefit of civil order. I don't have to live in a war of all against all. Life is not poor, nasty, brutish, and short, but I can make it even better for myself if I commit crimes in secret. Then I'll get the benefit of whatever I steal, for example. and I won't be penalized, which is the prohibition, what will keep people from doing that. So Critias recognizes this is a problem for the state of nature, and he's going to solve it in an ingenious way. So they acted secretly, it seems to me, that at this point, some clever and wise man, for the first time, invented fear of the gods for mortals, that the wicked might experience fear, even if they act or say or think something in secret. So again, this is an imaginary story. There was no time when a wise and clever man invented the idea of God. We can only imagine how the idea arose, but it's very doubtful that there was no conception of God, and then one day one guy said, hey, there's a God. But just like the state of nature itself, it's an imaginary scenario that's going to be used, as I say, eventually in modern liberalism, to underwrite or justify a certain political order. And in this case, once you accept this imagination, that this wise and clever ruler invents the idea of the gods, and especially punitive gods who see everything and punish evildoers, because this will solve the problem of people doing crime in secret, which the original scenario of laws without religion wasn't able to handle. Of course, now there's a new problem. How is this wise and clever ruler going to get a population to believe in fearful gods, or gods who should be feared? That's where sophistry will come in. The sophist is the expert at persuading crowds of even things that at first they find implausible or impossible. So good is the sophistical art. So let me continue. As a consequence, he introduced the divine. And then here is a little speech that Critias imagines this wise and clever ruler giving. There is a deity flourishing with indestructible life. Through mind it hears, sees, is extremely thoughtful, and attends to these things, bearing divine nature in itself. It will hear all that is said among mortals, and will be able to see all that is done. If in silence you plan some evil, this will not escape the notice of the gods, for thought is in it to too great a degree. That's the end of the little speech Critias imagines. Now, as I say, the idea of gods pre-existed Critias and any other Greek thinker for that matter. But there is the beginning of a way of thinking about God, at least in the Greek tradition, in the century before Critias. The thinker most important in this development is named Xenophanes, a thinker of the 6th century BC, so a century before Critias. And Xenophanes said something to this effect. It is mind, or he is mind, and he sees all things with the power of his mind. I'm not quoting it exactly, but the idea is of an omniscient deity. And Critias is an intellectual of the 5th century of Athens, where the intellectuals would have read these philosophers of the previous century of the Greek world and would have known that idea of Xenophanes. And, of course, that idea of Xenophanes can be matched with some parts of traditional Greek religion, but not all, because Zeus, for example, the head god of the popular religion, he doesn't see everything. The idea that God would see everything is, at least for the Greeks, an innovation of the philosophers, and Xenophanes in particular. So Critias appropriates this idea from earlier philosophy. It's called the pre-Socratic tradition in philosophy, about a dozen thinkers, the most famous of which are Heraclitus and Parmenides. Pythagoras might be another people have heard of. And he appropriates this idea, and in a typically sophistic fashion, he's not putting it forward as something that's true, and nor is he giving an argument that it's true. He's rather showing how it could be used to acquire power. This was a goal of the sophists. If not of particular sophists, it was a goal of their art, because once you acquire this ability to persuade large crowds, you gain a lot of power, at least you can gain a lot of power. And so Critias recognizes that the idea of an all-seeing God is a way to gain power. And in this case, he's assuming that the leader already has power, but that the leader recognizes there's a problem, namely people will do crimes in secret. Now, if they will believe that they might be punished and should be afraid of this God who sees everything, perhaps they'll stop. So continuing, making these statements, he introduced the most pleasant of doctrines, and with false discourse obscured the truth. Now, Critias is making clear that he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in gods, or at least a god of this sort. So it's a false speech, according to him, but politically useful. Going on, he claimed that the god inhabited a place where, merely by mentioning it, he could have frightened men extremely. Of course, this will be recognizable to most people listening as something rather like Christian hell. You mention Christian hell to believers in Christianity, especially of an older variety, and you can make them tremble. And if you associate doing certain things, even thinking certain things, with an eternity spent in a place like that, you have power over those people's minds. He claimed that the god inhabited a place where, merely by mentioning it, he could have frightened men extremely. He recognized that from this source there were fears for mortals and benefits for their wretched way of life, coming from heavenly revolution, where he saw that there existed lightning flashes and frightful thunderclaps, and the star-spangled frame of heaven, the lovely embroidery of time, wise craftsman. Here, Critias is waxing poetic, no doubt in the Greek, which I can't recall. There are poetic devices. He's showing off his mastery of the language, but he's alluding also to a straightforward psychological observation that before humans understood meteorology, one evidence many people accepted for the power of a god who punished was lightning. And Zeus's thunderbolt was the punishment for those who had transgressed Zeus's codes. So this wise and clever ruler he's imagining is going to pick up that popular aspect of religion, fuse it with Xenophanes' idea that this god sees everything, and trick the population into believing in a god like that in order to control them. Finally, two more sentences of this short fragment of Critias. From here, the bright mass of the star proceeds, and damp storm moves out toward earth. With such fears did he encircle men, through whom he settled the deity well via discourse and in a suitable location, and through laws he quelled lawlessness. The most important word in that final sentence is discourse, and that's a direct link to Foucault, who uses that word, or the French equivalent, discours. Discourse, the subject matter, the expertise of the sophists. They knew how to manipulate words in a way to control people's minds. And so Critias is imagining a perfect sophist ruler. I will mention, and this is looking far ahead into the podcast, much later we will discuss Lucretius, a Roman philosopher of the 1st century BC. And Lucretius was an Epicurean, which is to say he was a follower of Epicurus. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC. So Epicurus came, roughly 100 years after Critias. And Epicurus taught that you should live for pleasure, although he didn't understand that in the same way that most people do. He thought pleasure was the absence of pain rather than some ecstatic state. And that one of the biggest threats to the life of pleasure was anxiety about punishment by the gods. And we have only 3 documents from Epicurus, from his hand, let us say, 3 letters. And one of them is on ethics, how you should live your life. One of them is on physics, namely what is the nature of the world that underwrites that way of thinking about your life. But another is about meteorology. And you might think of all the philosophical topics, ethics and physics or the nature of the world should be up there, but why meteorology? Epicurus recognized that a lot of the fear of the gods came from a misunderstanding of celestial phenomena, from stars and shooting stars to thunderstorms and lightning bolts. So this idea that Critias is mentioning here, using meteorology to manipulate people, Epicurus will try and undo a century later by teaching what he took to be the physical nature of all those things. He has a theory of atoms and void that we'll discuss much later on to explain how thunder happens, how lightning happens, and so on. So there's Critias, and as I say, he's handy because he's a contemporary of Plato. He's going to help us connect Plato to Foucault. But the reason I choose him above all is that I think he has the nut of the idea that Foucault gives us in a more complicated form. One might say a subtler form. And it's the idea that we could be manipulated by other people through doctrines. And in this case, it's straightforwardly the doctrine of an omniscient, punitive God. Now, if you grew up, I will speak to you personally, if you grew up in a household where that was taught, especially as a child, you would take that to be real. And it might be so assumed by everybody in your household, your entire family, perhaps your town. You'd be going to church with other people who shared that belief. Everyone would be just assuming it was true. You might not get to the point, for a while anyway, of thinking, is this true or not? And then, say, deciding that it is or deciding that it isn't. Imagine a state of mind such as the child is in, where it's never even asked whether such a being exists. I mean, we think about Santa Claus. My kids recently, well, one of them at any rate, went through the crisis of losing his belief in Santa Claus, rationally thinking it through and realizing how in the world can Santa Claus make it to that many homes in one night, and those kinds of questions. And he gave up his belief in Santa Claus. Whereas I have a younger child, and it was clear that for her, it just wasn't even a question. I mean, my son started raising the question, and then she started to have to assert, yes, Santa Claus is real. But before my son started asking those questions out loud, it's not that my daughter thought Santa Claus might exist or he might not, but I am going to believe that he does. Rather, it just wasn't a question for her. She just assumed Santa Claus existed and acted accordingly, wrote letters to him and so on. And that's the kind of mind control, if you like, that Critias thinks would be the most powerful tool for a tyrant. If the tyrant could get his subjects into a state of mind where they not only accept as true what he wants them to believe, in this case, the punitive God, so that he can control them and keep them from committing crimes in order to benefit and profit from them as much as possible. And of course, one of those crimes would be to depose the tyrant. That would have the strictest penalty if the ruler were wise and clever and were doing all of this to preserve his own power. So it's not only that he wants the people to believe this, he doesn't want them to believe it because it's a question for them and then they believe it. Now, he wants them to believe it in the deepest possible sense, that it's not even a question for them. It's just a background assumption of the way they live their lives. And that's what life is like, according to Plato, for the prisoners in the cave. When it comes to those images on the wall, it's not that they think these could be images or they could be real, but I believe they're real. No, they just treat them as real. So deep is their entrapment in that cave. So with that in mind, I want to talk about Foucault now. And just as a reminder, Foucault is going to give us an argument that we are entrapped in modern society by something like the idea of God. And the idea of God will be involved in this. It can be, certainly. It doesn't have to be. And this entrapment, this thing that is going to shape all of our lives and be a background of all of our lives to such a great degree, to penetrate so deeply into our soul that we don't even notice that it exists. All right, so let's turn to Foucault. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about ideas that Foucault records in the book called in English, Discipline and Punish, from the 70s. And this is a book about the history of the prison as an institution. And as I mentioned earlier, he's going to use the prison as emblematic of a trend, if you like, a pattern in all of modern society. And of course, I'm not going to talk about the entire book. I'm going to talk about the final chapter, which is called Panopticism. And Panopticism is a complex word, comes from pan and optic, all seeing. So the connection with Critias might already be evident. Remember, Critias talked about an all-seeing God. And so the panopticon is a type of prison that we'll talk about in a moment that was designed by Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher of the 18th century, so that everything could be seen about a criminal. And so panopticism is an ideology or a pattern, if you like, that that kind of prison symbolizes. So in the chapter, Foucault begins by talking about plagues, of all things. And he's talking about pre-modern Europe and what would happen when a plague hit a town. And of course, in that era, there was no germ theory or no actionable germ theory, but it was known that you would catch these things from touching people, being near them. And so this, when a plague would hit a town, the authorities would go into an emergency or crisis management mode. And one thing they would do would be to partition the town so that the people who were suffering from the plague would be in one place, people who weren't suffering from the plague would be in another place. And it was important to keep complete control over the movement of people, because even the people who weren't yet suffering from the plague could be harboring the plague. Again, no germ theory, no way to test whether they had the virus yet or not. Of course, it wasn't even known to be a virus. But if you could keep records of everybody's movements, if you could keep everybody in particular places, let's say a family had to remain only with their family in their own house, and that way, if that family's not moving about through the town, if somebody in the family gets the plague afterwards, after the town has been partitioned, well, then you know that, say, the 3 other people in that household are also at risk for having the plague in a way that somebody who's in a household that hasn't yet gotten the plague is not at the same risk. So in this crisis management mode, bodies, as Foucault likes to say, never misses an opportunity to talk about human bodies rather than people, but bodies would be partitioned in space and they would be surveyed. It was important that officials would go around the town and make observations about the progress of the plague in certain houses, in certain districts. And there were strict rules that everybody had to follow. No going out at night, curfews, and so on. And so there would be extreme punishments for anyone who diverged from those rules. So it's a combination of surveillance and punishment that Foucault describes in a pre-modern management of a plague. And again, this is the way that these towns dealt with crises. For Foucault, the importance of this is that he thinks in the 18th century, Europe went through a shift, and it continued into the 19th and 20th century. And he thinks, he thought it was still with him, with his society in his time when he died in the 80s. And I think if he's right about what happened in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, he's even more right about what's happening in the 21st century, as I'll say eventually in this episode. But basically, he thought that in the 18th century, European societies took that model that was typical of how to deal with a crisis, such as a plague, and they started to treat everyday life in that way. And the name he gives for that way of dealing with everyday life is discipline. So the discipline, again, very abstract. You have to get used to, with Foucault, even though he's writing histories and can sometimes talk about quite visceral things like pus coming out of a boil in a plague, he also will be speaking quite abstractly about, in this case, discipline, where discipline is a way of organizing bodies, a way of bodies interacting with one another, ways bodies or people have of thinking about their interactions. And this discipline was not only to correct the abnormal, the way that in a plague crisis, someone who gets the plague is abnormal and has to be dealt with in a certain way or corrected. Someone who's sick has to be either made healthy or separated from those who are healthy. Discipline was not only a way to correct people who were abnormal, it was also a way to make people into the normal. So again, go back to the plague-stricken city. Before the plague came, there was no regime such as the crisis management system that was instituted when the plague arrived, with the spatial partitioning and the surveillance and the violent punishment and so on. And so people lived their lives. Not to say that you could do anything in pre-modern Europe, but Foucault thinks that in the 18th century, this era of the birth of discipline, and not coincidentally, the birth of the prison, which is the subtitle of his book, Discipline and Punish. When discipline arrives, it's not only to correct the abnormal, to make the sick back into healthy, or at least correct them by separating them from the healthy. But it's to make the healthy. It's to make people into certain kinds of people. And Foucault thinks that what the 18th century did was it realized that if human society were organized according to this kind of plan, kind of like the way the plague city would be organized, human society, European civilizations could be made much more efficient than they were before. And of course, that's true. Western Europe especially became rapidly much more efficient than it had been before these transformations of the 18th and especially the 19th century happened. And so even though industrialization is more a 19th century phenomenon than an 18th century phenomenon, it does start to some extent in the 18th century. And it's the kind of thinking that we associate with factories that is a good way of thinking about discipline. So let me just jump ahead in the story a bit to, think about a factory. You've got people coming in, an unruly mass of workers. Imagine standing in a line, going in, putting in their check cards so it's known exactly when they arrive. And then they each go to their particular station so that the arrangement of bodies has been partitioned very precisely the way it was in the plague-stricken city. And there's an overseer who surveys everybody on the production line, makes sure everyone's doing their small task. And as long as everybody's doing their small task and the machines are working and all the bodies have been arranged in the right way, you're going to get much more efficiency out of a factory than you would get out of, say, 100 workers, each working on the same product on his own. And we get that intuitively when it comes to industry and factories especially. And Foucault's trying to show us that that way of thinking wasn't born in the 19th century, but rather was born in the 18th century, and that it happened not only in factories, but also in hospitals and military barracks and schools and prisons. And so he writes other books about those other institutions, but the book that we're talking about in this episode is about the prison, Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. Now, this prison that I mentioned earlier, invented by Jeremy Bentham, he invented the idea of this prison. I don't think he ever supervised the building of one, although one was built in New York State. And in the book, if you ever get a chance to look at it, the Viking edition, there is, at least in the one that I own, there's a black and white photographic plate of this prison in New York. I don't know if others were built around the world either. But at any rate, it's called the Panopticon, the all-seeing place. And now, it's much easier for me to draw it on the board, but I'll describe it. I think you'll get the picture. Imagine, it's a circular building, and it's a ring, so that, from the outside, it looks like a tower. But say looked at from the top, there's a big hollow space in the middle. So it's a donut-shaped building, but tall, like a tower. And this is pre-electricity in the 18th century, so this was ingenious. The cells are on the circumference of that donut-shaped tower. And so the light comes in and illuminates the prisoners, each of whom is spatially partitioned into a separate cell. But in the middle of the tower, in that hollow space, there's another tower. And in that tower, there is the warden, or at least there can be the warden. The warden can climb up the stairs and get into a position where he can see any particular prisoner that he likes, because there are going to be many floors of this, and they're going to completely encircle his mini tower in the middle. But because all of those prisoners are going to be backlit by the sun, whereas he, the warden, is going to be in this tower in the darkness in the middle of this donut-shaped building, they won't be able to see him. The prisoners will not be able to see the warden, but the warden will be able to see them. In fact, he'll be able to see any one of them at any time he likes. Now, for this to be effective, the warden has to spend some time in the tower. He has to, he or his team has to supervise, survey the criminals, the convicts in their cells, and survey them closely enough so that the team of the warden can catch them whenever they do anything wrong in their cell, whatever that might be, and then punish them for it. But if they do that effectively enough for a while, think of yourself arriving as a convict to spend 10 years in a place like this. If when you arrive, they pay special attention to you because they know that you're new to this institution and they want to show you that you're being watched at all times. If they were to do that reliably for a while, a few weeks, a few months, the first few years, you would get the idea that it was a bad idea to do anything that you're not supposed to do in that cell and become fearful of the surveillance of the warden and his team. But because you wouldn't be able to see whether the warden was in the tower at any particular time, it would be safest to assume that he was at all times. And that was the point for Bentham, that this institution would teach criminals to get a conscience. That is to say, if you were to go in the prison because you committed a crime which showed that you didn't have the right conception of right and wrong, or that conception that you hadn't penetrated deeply enough into who you were that it affected your action, by spending long enough in this prison, you would internalize the eye of the warden, the judgment of the warden, the fear of the punishment of the warden. That would become a part of you, so that when the process was complete, let's say the wise judge gave you 10 years because he knew that that's exactly how long it would take in this institution for you to get the kind of conscience that you lacked when you committed the crime. When you emerge 10 years later, you're not going to commit that crime or crimes like it anymore, because now you have inside of you a little warden that you've internalized. Now, this is one of the reasons, as I said, why I did the Critias. So you remember from earlier in the episode, God of Critias, the imaginary God, Critias thought it was imaginary, is something that the wise and clever ruler will get the subjects to believe in, even though Critias thinks that God doesn't exist. Well, what Foucault has observed in this prison of Jeremy Bentham, and more widely in Discipline, which we'll get to in a moment, is that even in a godless society, a society that doesn't believe in God anymore, and of course that starts to become not yet a widespread phenomenon in the 18th century, but intellectuals are seriously considering it, and some are even proposing that there is no God. And again, not to say that there were never atheists in the history of the world. There were famously just a few among the ancient Greek philosophers, but as I say, it starts to become more common among the intellectuals, and it doesn't become more common in wider society until 19th and 20th century, at least in the West. So Foucault's observing that in the 18th century, and I'm not even sure that I don't remember whether he makes this connection himself or I'm imposing it on him, but I find it interesting. So let me just go with it for the moment. That as faith in, or fear, more particularly fear in the omniscient, punitive God diminishes, there arises these institutions, at least in this particular case, the prison, that can play that role. Namely, if you go wrong, you go in and you come out with effectively the idea of God, but the idea of the warden, and in this case, the omniscient, punitive other who will keep you from committing that crime. So as I say, this is just one of many institutions that Foucault describes in other places in his project to describe this change in European society. Think about the school. We could think about the factory we already have to some extent. You can think about the military barracks. Foucault says this is kind of like the militarization of all of society. I did it through the plague history, but it could also be done through a military barrack where, in the military, people are partitioned according to their particular beds and their particular role and rank in the line of battle. And there's intense surveillance of each soldier and punishments for stepping out of line, like being shot in the back. So we could tell it as a history of the military, or as a history of factories, or as a history of the prison, which we've started to do with Foucault's help. But I think it's probably best to think about the school. And I'm not remembering exactly what Foucault says about the school, but we've all been through schools that are rather like what he's describing. And we sort of take it for granted that that's what a school is like. But in ancient Athens, there weren't schools of the sort that you and I have most likely shared an experience of. So take, a standard public school in the United States, for example, not different from public schools in most Western countries. They start at a certain time. You've got to be there. Otherwise, you get punishment or a demerit of some sort. And when you're there, you've got to be in certain rooms at certain times, and you need passes to go from one room to another. All the bodies are kept track of precisely, and the subjects are divided according to times and to specific rooms. And the homework assignments are quite clear, and especially when the No Child Left Behind educational regime started in the last decade, the lessons plans are even regimented from government agencies. And there are punishments for the students for departing from any number of these rules. And so if we've emerged from a system like that, I mean, think back about your own education and the effect that it had on you. You often can't remember the content of particular classes. A lot of that just gets lost. But the habits that such a system inculcates in people, those don't get lost. And so someone who's made it through that system, graduated from high school, knows how to sit still for an hour at a time, knows where she's supposed to be at a particular time, and can move to a different room at the other time because that's on the plan of the day, and knows to at least get a semblance of the assignments done in order to pass. And if you think about an industrial society, such a school is well designed for the preparation of industrial workers. And so an analysis of the school that I'm not attributing here to Foucault, but that I think is plausible, is that we even still live with schools that are designed to produce industrial labor, even though we've moved out of the industrial era. The reason I focus on schools is not only because it's an experience that most of us have shared, but that it makes clear Foucault's point that I made earlier in contrast with the plague. Remember, with the plague, people were there living their lives, not worrying about plagues or about how to deal with plagues. And then the plague comes and a regime is instituted, and it deals with the abnormal, the sick. Discipline, by contrast, this abstract thing that Foucault thinks and argues started in the 18th century. Discipline doesn't just deal with the abnormal. So it's not just when somebody commits a crime, they go to prison, or somebody who's out of line in the military gets shot. Rather, discipline makes people into the normal before they even become abnormal. And this is just clearest in the school, where you've got children who are, and they're not blank slates, of course, but they're more impressionable than adults. And the school forms in them habits that makes them into who they are. So if you're the kind of person, for example, who feels anxious if you don't have a script for the day, the way school can give you a script for the day, that could be because you were trained for so many years in such a system. And it really is remarkable from a historical perspective how long we spend in schools. We start when we're 5, and we're not legally allowed, I don't think, to leave until we're 17 or so. So that's 12 years in such a system. That's a big portion of people's lives, the most impressionable time of their lives. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be schools or public schools. It's just a matter of fact, as compared with most other societies at most times. There aren't such things, namely these highly regimented institutions into which every person must pass. Again, in Athens, there weren't any public schools, and the education that was given only to the elites, of course, was nothing like the regimented sort that we have. So, to make the broader point about discipline, Foucault thinks that discipline doesn't just deal with individuals and keep them in line. It makes individuals into the kind of people they are. And this is a very efficient form of power. The book begins with a story of a regicide, somebody who tried to kill the French king. So I don't think he actually committed it, so he's not a regicide, attempted regicide. At any rate, remember Critias's tyrant. He's making the laws and he's making the religion in order to keep himself in power. And so what would be the worst crime you could commit? Well, it would be to threaten the very man who's making the rules. So with that regicide, there had to be an extraordinary punishment. And the book, as I say, Foucault is capable of writing very directly and viscerally. The book begins with a dramatization of an actual drawing and quartering of a regicide or attempted regicide in a square in Paris. And that is effective to some extent. Someone who thinks about attempting to kill the king will think twice if he sees that happening, or then again, he might want to do it even more. It's costly in time and manpower to do that to somebody. And as I say, it could in fact have the opposite effect. And so if you really wanted to prevent someone from committing regicide or trying to commit regicide, it would be more effective not to punish the people who try in that extraordinary way, in that violent way, but rather control their minds from the beginning so that the idea never occurs to them. That's that Platonic idea of the prisoners at the bottom of the cave, where it's not that they think this might be real, this might not, I think it's real. Rather, it never occurs to them to ask that question. So if you're running a society, let's say at the beginning of the 18th century, and you've got this problem of how to efficiently deal with criminals, and the regicide makes the problem very clear. Well, at the beginning of the century, Foucault thinks the way to deal with it was wait till someone does something wrong and then make an example out of them and punish them in some extraordinarily violent way. Something happens in the 18th century in the penal systems of Europe, at any rate. France is his main concern. Something happens so that punishment is no longer considered to be retributive in that way. Namely, you did this wrong, this horrible thing will be done to you to make you an example, to right the wrong of injustice and so on. Justice as retribution, justice as deterrence. Instead, justice begins to be considered a reformative practice, a corrective practice. And you think now about our prisons, they're not called halls of retribution or let alone dungeons of torture, even though that's basically what they are. Instead, they're called correctional facilities. And so we're living with, in our penal system, the ideology that, according to Foucault, begins in the 18th century and is really epitomized by Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, where the prison is there not to torture the body of the prisoner, to right some redress, to redress some injustice, but rather to reform that criminal, to make him a better person, to give him a conscience so that he goes back out into society and is able to do that, be the better person, not commit the crime. And as I've mentioned, it would be even more efficient if one in the 18th century could design schools that trained people to be obedient before they ever thought of being disobedient in that dramatic way that the attempted regicide was. So that craving for efficiency that Foucault pinpoints to the 18th century, that spread very quickly to all kinds of institutions that changed themselves throughout the progress of that century, so that by the 19th century, we had, in Europe and in America as well, an interlocking set of institutions that are making us obedient in ways that we don't even recognize. It's not, again, that we say, I could be disobedient, but the price of disobedience is too high, I'm going to be obedient. Rather, we just are obedient without even noticing it. That's the effect of discipline. So discipline is much deeper than the law. It's not about codes and punishments for breaching the codes. Remember Critias. First there was a state of nature, then there was civil society, it was called by the English philosophers. Civil society of the laws, the breaking of the laws, the punishments, when justice will make arrogance a slave. It's deeper than that. It goes into the minds of the citizens and controls them there, so that they're like prisoners in Plato's cave. Finally, at least for our purposes, Foucault notices that the prisoners in the prison are not simply given consciences. That's not the only purpose. Another purpose is what we call in philosophy epistemological. It's about knowledge. Because when the prisoners are divided up, partitioned in that way, and can be observed constantly by the warden or by a team of wardens, they can be studied. And quantified studies can be made of their behavior, how they react to different punishments, how often they look one way rather than another way. Anything one wishes to study about someone who's in a cage can then be done, and done effectively, because the convict doesn't know whether he's being watched. an important part of an experiment is that, that the subject of the experiment doesn't know that he's part of an experiment. I don't know that it's always important, but it's an important element in some experiments at any rate. So the prison, but also the schools and the hospitals and the barracks and the other institutions that, if they don't arise in the 18th century, transform in the 18th century, they all become like laboratories for the study of human nature, we might say. And what is that knowledge used for? Foucault thinks it's being used to strengthen the power of discipline. Because after all, if the goal of the prison is to implant a conscience in somebody, and now someone's in that panopticon and can be studied in the way that is possible for the first time in that setting, well, that knowledge can then be used to design a better prison or design a better routine for that prison to implant more of a conscience, more deeply, more quickly. And it becomes a cycle, virtuous or vicious, depending on what you think of discipline in Foucault's sense. Discipline begets more discipline, begets more discipline. The power that is exercised over the criminals or the students in the schools or the workers in the factories, the power that's exercised over them makes possible a kind of knowledge. And that knowledge then gives more power to the discipline to the routine of power. So that there's an interaction between power and knowledge. And ultimately, Foucault doesn't see the difference. I mean, I don't want to say he doesn't. To put more charitably to him, power is knowledge and knowledge is power. The relationship between them is that tight. Even if they're not the same thing, there's a very tight feedback loop between them. And so of the many, to my mind, fascinating consequences of this argument, there's this that I grapple with and think about all the time, and I invite you to think about as well. We think of the 18th century, in many ways, of course, but in one way as an era of the birth of a kind of freedom. Now, not everybody became free in the 18th century. There were still slaves, of course. There was still racism, of course, and sexism and so on. But it was the era of the democratic revolutions, first the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. And so it was the beginning of an era of democracy, of more freedom for more people, which continues. The circle of legal freedoms has continued to expand through the American Civil War, for example, and the liberation of the slaves, through the Civil Rights era in the 1960s and the liberation of Black Americans from the Jim Crow era. So we think of the 18th century typically as the era of the birth of freedom, or at least a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln called it in the 19th century. But Foucault's argument adds another dimension that is really worth thinking about. And as he puts it, and I'll just read this one quotation from him, the Enlightenment, now the Enlightenment is the name that we give to that period, the 18th century roughly, a disparate group of thinkers. The Enlightenment, which discovered the liberties, also invented the disciplines. So on the surface, it was an era of increasing liberty. But below the surface, Foucault's arguing, it was the birth of a new way of enslaving people. And take the prison system again. No longer does the government have to draw and quarter, horrible crime, a horrible punishment that, by the way, people would flock to see and cheer in the description Foucault gives. The government no longer does cruel and unusual punishments, as one of the amendments to the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights, prohibits. No longer cruel and unusual punishments. Instead, prisons take a rehabilitative, corrective, reformative goal and are supposed to be humane. But of course, anyone who looks inside a prison, even through the many dramas that we have available to us immediately by consulting Netflix, for example, the rape statistics in prison, the gangs, it's a nightmare. It's a way to terrorize somebody, is to drop them into that system. It is inhumane, and yet we persist in the illusion that we don't enforce cruel and unusual punishments. Now, I'm not saying I know what the alternative is. I'm not saying I know how we should punish our criminals, what the best, most efficient, most humane system would be. All I'm saying in this episode is that I think Foucault's onto something, that there was a giant sleight of hand that happened in the 18th century and that we're still living with, that we began to think of ourselves as widening the domain of freedom. But in order to do so, this wasn't coincidental. We allowed ourselves more freedoms, or the government, we'll say for the moment, allowed us more freedoms only because we became more obedient. In other words, it was possible to give more freedoms to a population that was becoming more predictable and more obedient because of the disciplines. So those two things went together. Now, I'm going to talk about Black Mirror episodes in separate episodes of this podcast. And I'll just look forward for the moment to one of them called Nosedive, which is among the most popular, if I'm not mistaken. And in that episode, everyone in that world that Charlie Brooker, the director of Black Mirror, the world that he imagines, everyone in that world is obsessed with social media. So it's not unlike Facebook. And yet they have, as you know, if you've seen the episode, they have implants in their eye that allow them to see the profile of anyone with whom they interact. So they can immediately see their photos they posted and facts about them. And if you forget the person's name, you could just sort of look them in the eye, but also simultaneously look at their name. If you're stuck next to them in the elevator and you want to appear to remember them better than you do. But more perniciously, everybody has a social score, upvotes and downvotes and the average of them all. And so you can immediately see someone's social score. And in that episode, people are relating to each other based on social scores. And it's a drama of what happens to a woman whose social score goes up for a while, giving her hopes that her life is going to change, and then it starts to plummet. And once it plummets very quickly, and her life changes very dramatically. And if you haven't seen the episode, I won't spoil it for you here, except to say the vicissitudes of her social score show a lot about human nature, I think. At any rate, the reason I bring it up right now as my final thought about Foucault for this episode is that, as I hinted earlier, I think that the disciplines that Foucault exposes as beginning in the 18th century have only become intensified since he died, since the 80s, because now we have social media, and many of us, I suspect most of the people listening to this podcast, insofar as you're online, are on social media a lot. And when we do that, we open our minds, certainly, to the opinions of other people almost directly. And if we participate in it, not just by lurking, but putting ourselves out there with tweets and posts and so on, we are subjecting ourselves to the approval and disapproval of other people with the thumbs up and the thumbs down and the hearts and all the rest of it. So that a way of enforcing a conformity of mind and emotion is now available through our participation in social media that I don't think Foucault could even have dreamt. I don't want to underestimate him. He did dream of it. He just, I don't know that he could have foreseen exactly the way it was going to happen. Who in 1981 or 82 could have seen the world we live in now in 2019. But let me make this final observation. I was speaking earlier about the government doing things. So the government makes certain kinds of prison systems so that the government or the tyrant or the king, really make it clear, one person exercises power over a subject population. That's what Critias imagined. But Foucault's analysis is much broader and more subtle, and I think truer, especially in our era, that there doesn't need to be one ruler who's doing all of this to stabilize his power, to promote his power, to keep himself in power, to subject us, to manipulate us, and so on. We live in democracies, maybe nominally so, but democracies. They're certainly on the legal level freer than almost any other societies in the history of the world. So if there isn't one ruler who's ruling us all in this, ingenious disciplinary way, especially through social media, what's happening instead is that we're doing it to each other. And that's not to say that, any one of us is ingeniously moving the pack in one direction rather than another. We're all trying to push the pack and ourselves in different directions all the time, but patterns emerge and societies start doing strange things, as we know in the last few years. And that's why Foucault, I think, speaks so abstractly about power, because to return to the point about power and knowledge, that power creates institutions that make new kinds of knowledge possible. And then when that new kind of knowledge is acquired, that makes the institution more powerful and can adapt and so on. Now, if you apply that analysis to a democracy, to a group of nominally free people, and yet notice that the operation of discipline is true, then no one person, or perhaps even any class of people, to put Marx aside for the moment, not any class of people might be benefiting from this system, but just this thing, power, this very abstraction power is growing. And what's it growing at the expense of? Well, I'll get to the Black Mirror episode in a separate episode, but I think that's a marvelous story of how power grows at the expense of the human soul and of the human spirit, and that by the end of that episode, we see that the human spirit isn't crushed. It's one of the only optimistic episodes in the whole show, the whole series of episodes of Black Mirror. But at any rate, I'm not a Foucauldian. I don't present Foucault as ultimately true, but I think Foucault has a lot of important things to say about where we are now, and that it's very hard to understand where we are now without Foucault. And I hope that this has at least given you a way to think about that as well.